The day my daughter-in-law called me a burden in front of my entire family was the day 31 years of silence ended. And I promise you, that silence had been worth a great deal more than she ever stopped to consider. Welcome, friends. Get comfortable. Pour yourself something warm and stay with me, because the people in this story had every opportunity to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I think you're going to want to hear every word of this one. But let me go back to the beginning, because if I start at the moment she opened her mouth at that dinner table, you'll miss everything that gave it meaning. My name is Raymond Doyle. I'm 63 years old. I live in a gray craftsman house on Elmwood Drive in Naperville, Illinois, about 30 miles west of Chicago. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer, built a consulting firm from nothing but a drafting table and a second-hand truck, retired at 61 with contracts still on the books, and now I spend my mornings walking the Fox River Trail and my evenings reading on the back porch with a glass of iced tea. My life is quiet now, and I earned every inch of that quiet. At the center of all of it is my son, Daniel. Danny is 38. He works in operations for a logistics company in Schaumburg. He's got his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which is not always a convenient combination, but it produced a man I am genuinely proud of. His wife is Brianna. They've been married 9 years. They have 2 kids, Connor, who is 7, and Lily, who just turned 5 in March. I love those grandchildren more than I have words for. I coached Connor's t-ball for 2 seasons. Lily calls me Pop Pop, and it does something to a man's chest every single time. Now, I also need to tell you about my brother, Frank. Frank is 67, 4 years older than me, lives over in Joliet in a house that is considerably larger than what he needs. Frank was a sales manager for a medical device company for most of his career. He did well enough. But Frank has a particular way of measuring success that requires him to be doing slightly better than whoever he's standing next to. For most of our lives, that was fine. I understood Frank. I knew how to manage him. What I did not fully account for was Renata. Renata is Frank's wife. They married 16 years ago when Frank was in his early 50s and Renata was 39. She is sharp, well-dressed, and absolutely fluent in the language of subtle condescension. She never says anything overtly cruel. People like Renata never do. It's all in the phrasing, the small hesitations before she answers a question, the way she angles compliments so they land as comparisons, the particular smile she uses when she's talking about someone else's choices as though they were symptoms. From the very first holiday dinner I attended after they married, Renata had decided something about me. I'm not sure exactly what the story was she'd put together in her head, but the broad outline was clear. Frank was the successful brother. Raymond was the one who had gotten by. I had never risen to Frank's level. I was pleasant company, reasonably harmless, and ultimately not someone who warranted serious consideration. What Renata did not know, what she never took enough interest to find out, was that the consulting firm I had built quietly over 20 years had done considerably better than Frank's salary ever did. I am not a man who discusses money at dinner tables, so I never corrected the impression. I let it sit. I kept showing up to family gatherings in my same old jacket, driving the same sensible truck, saying the same steady things. And the impression stayed exactly where Renata had placed it. The arrangement that complicated everything started about 6 years ago. Danny's company went through a brutal round of layoffs. He survived them, but took a significant pay cut, and at the same time, Brianna had stepped back from her own job to be home with Lily, who had some early developmental concerns that required extra support and time. The mortgage on their house in Wheaton became a genuine problem. Connor was in first grade. Things were tight in a way that can quietly unravel a young family if nobody reaches out a hand. Danny called me. He is not a man who asks for help easily. He got that from me too, and I could hear what it cost him to make that call. I told him to come over that Saturday. We sat at my kitchen table, and I looked at my son, and I thought about every early morning and late night that built what I had, and I thought about what all of it was actually for. I set up a monthly transfer directly into their account, enough to cover the gap between what they had and what they needed. I told Danny one thing. Don't tell Brianna, it's coming from me. Tell her it's from a family assistance account we set up years ago. I had a specific reason for that request. Brianna had always been a little sensitive about the balance of things between my side of the family and Frank and Renata. I didn't want her feeling indebted to me in a way that created friction in her marriage. I wanted the help to be invisible. I wanted Danny and Brianna to be able to breathe without the weight of obligations sitting at their dinner table every night. So, Danny agreed. The transfers went out every month. Brianna got back on steady footing. Lily got the support she needed. Connor stayed in his school. The family stabilized. And nobody outside that kitchen conversation knew a single thing about it. 6 years is a long time for a secret to hold. This one held because I kept my end, and Danny kept his. But here is the thing about silence and money. They are a combination that sooner or later gets tested. The test arrived on a Saturday evening in October. The dinner was at Frank and Renata's place in Joliet. They have a formal dining room they use approximately 3 times a year, and when they use it, the chandelier is on, and the good china is out, and Renata has spent the afternoon arranging the table so that everything communicates a specific message about who lives in that house. It was a birthday celebration for Frank, 67 years old. The guest list was Frank and Renata, myself, Danny, and Brianna, the grandchildren, and 2 of Frank and Renata's adult kids from Renata's previous marriage, Marcus and Jill. I was in a fine mood that evening. The drive down from Naperville was easy. The fall colors on the interstate were the kind of thing that makes you grateful you're still around to see them. I brought Frank a bottle of single malt I knew he'd been hunting for, and I was looking forward to a decent meal and a quiet drive home. We were about 40 minutes into dinner when it started. Lily had knocked over her juice cup. It was an accident, she's 5, and it went across her placemat and onto the tablecloth. Brianna was already on her feet, apologizing before the cup finished rolling. I grabbed my napkin. Danny stood up. It was the kind of small chaos that happens when you invite small children to formal dining rooms. Everyone at the table who has ever raised a child knows that. You hand over napkins. You mop it up. You move on. Renata did not move on. She made a sound. Not a word, a sound. The specific sound of a woman who has just watched something happen to her tablecloth that she is going to spend the rest of the evening referencing. Then she stood up with a composure that was somehow more pointed than anger would have been, and said to Brianna, with that smile, "Don't worry about it. Some things just can't be helped. Some things just can't be helped." Brianna sat back down. I watched her face. I saw what landed there, and I saw her decide to let it pass. Danny saw it too. 20 minutes later, the conversation had moved to the topic of the house. Frank was talking about renovation plans for their kitchen. Renata was discussing countertop options with Jill, who is an interior designer, and it had the comfortable quality of people, spending money they have in front of people they consider to have less of it. Then Renata looked down the table at Danny and said, in that pleasant, inquiring voice she uses like a scalpel, "And how are things going over in Wheaton? I know the market has been such a challenge for young families. Are you two managing all right?" Danny said they were doing well, thank you. Renata nodded with enormous, patient sympathy. Of course. It's just so hard at that age. Frank and I were talking the other night about how stretched young couples are these days. It must be a relief to have family support to lean on. Family support. She said it with just enough weight to mean exactly what she intended it to mean. She was looking at Danny when she said it. The implication was clear to everyone at that table who was paying attention. Danny and Brianna were being taken care of. They were leaning on people. They were, in the word she had chosen carefully and deliberately, managing. I set my fork down. I did it quietly, without drama. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. I looked at Brianna, who was looking at her plate. I looked at Danny, who had gone very still, in the specific way he does when he's deciding whether to say something. And then Renata turned to me with that same smile and said, "I'm sure you've done what you could for them, Raymond. That's what family does, isn't it? We all contribute what we're able." What we're able. What happened next, I want to describe precisely, because I have spent 63 years learning the difference between reacting and deciding. What I felt in that moment was not anger. It was something colder and more final than anger. It was the feeling of a man who has watched a quiet and fundamental insult repeat itself for 16 years and has now watched it extend itself to his son's wife and his grandchildren at a dinner table set with someone else's. China. Lily climbed down from her booster seat, walked around the table, and pressed herself against my arm the way she does. I put my hand on top of her head, 5 years old, looking up at me with those enormous dark eyes. Pop, Pop, are you done with your potatoes? I looked at her. Yes, sweetheart. Can I have them? The table laughed. The tension broke for just a moment, the way it does when a child says the exact right thing without knowing it. Excuse me for just a minute, I said to no one in particular. I picked up my phone, pushed back my chair, and stepped out through Frank's back door onto the deck. It was a cold October evening. The yard was dark, and the neighbors' lights were on 2 houses down. I stood there for about 30 seconds, long enough to make one decision. Then I came back inside. I sat down. I looked at Renata. She was refilling her wine glass and talking to Jill about tile options. Renata, I said. She looked up with polite attention. I want to make sure I understand what you said. You said I contribute what I'm able to this family. She tilted her head with that patient, faintly condescending expression. Raymond, I only meant... I'm not finished. I said it without raising my voice. I kept my tone exactly where it was, level and conversational and entirely certain. I want you to understand something about the family support you mentioned, because I think you have a picture in your head about this family that has some significant gaps in it. The table had gone quiet. The monthly support that has allowed Danny and Brianna to keep their house, keep Connor in school, get Lily the specialists she needed that has been coming from my account for 6 years. Not from a family fund, not from Frank, from mine, directly. Brianna's head came up. I asked Danny not to specify the source because I didn't want it to create any obligation or imbalance. That was my choice. But since you've chosen to characterize it as contributing what I'm able, I thought you should know exactly what that looks like. The room was completely silent. Frank set down his fork. Marcus, Renata's son, was looking at the tablecloth. Jill had stopped talking about tile. Renata opened her mouth. I kept going. Now, I've sat at tables with you for 16 years, Renata. I've heard the questions about whether the business was doing all right. I've heard the way you talked to Danny and Brianna about managing. I've let it sit every single time because I love my brother, and I didn't see the point in making every family dinner a referendum on who has what. That was a choice I made, but tonight you did it in front of my grandchildren, and that is a different matter. Lily, who had finished my potatoes and was coloring quietly with a set of markers Brianna had pulled from her bag, looked up and said, "Pop, Pop," very softly. Not sure what was happening, but aware of the temperature in the room. "I'm right here, sweetheart." I didn't look away from Renata. Brianna had her hand over her mouth. I couldn't tell yet what she was feeling. I would find out later. Frank cleared his throat. He looked like a man watching a slow-motion event he had somehow known was coming for years. "Raymond," he said. "Let's not..." "Frank." I looked at my brother steadily. "Let me finish." He nodded. "Frank is 4 years older than me and still, underneath all of it, my brother." He nodded. "I am not interested in what anyone at this table thinks about my finances," I said. "I have never been interested in that. But I will not sit here and let my son and his wife be talked to like they are charity recipients by someone who has spent 16 years deciding I don't warrant a straight look." I folded my napkin and placed it on the table, with both hands flat. "That ends tonight. Right now, at this table." Renata was very still. The practiced composure she carries like body armor had done something I had never seen it do before. It had cracked, just at the edges, just enough to show what was underneath, which was a woman who had miscalculated badly and knew it and was trying to figure out how far she had fallen. "Raymond," she said, and her voice had completely changed register. Gone was the pleasant dinner party tone. What replaced it was quieter and more careful. "I wasn't trying to diminish you. I simply... You said I contribute what I'm able." I looked at her. "That's not an accident of phrasing, Renata. That's exactly what you meant." She was quiet. Frank reached over and put his hand on her arm. I don't know if it was to stop her or to steady himself or both. "I'm going to take the children to the front room," Brianna said softly. She stood, picked up Lily, and took Connor's hand. Connor looked up at me with 7-year-old seriousness. I winked at him. He seemed unsure what to do with that, which is developmentally appropriate. They went down the hall. Danny looked across the table at me, and I saw something on my son's face that I had not expected. He was not embarrassed. He was not uncomfortable. He was looking at me the way you look at someone when you realize you have known them your whole life but have just seen them more clearly than ever before. I should have said something, Danny said quietly, to the table, or to me, or just to the room. A long time ago, I should have said something. You didn't need to, I told him. That was my call. Frank was looking at his plate. He wasn't defending Renata. He wasn't defending me. He was doing what Frank does when he's genuinely reckoning with something, which is go very quiet and stare at something that isn't anyone's face. I stood up. Happy birthday, Frank. I meant it. That's still true. The rest of this is separate. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. I'm going to say goodnight to the kids, and then I'm going to drive home. I don't need an apology tonight. I don't need anything resolved this evening. But I needed what just happened to happen, and now it has. I walked down the hall to the front room. Connor was sitting on the floor with his markers. Lily was on Brianna's lap. Brianna looked up at me, and she had been crying, not the dramatic kind, the quiet, private kind, and I understood immediately that it wasn't about the dinner. How long? She said. 6 years. She closed her eyes. Brianna, I sat down on the ottoman across from her. I didn't do it to create a debt. I did it so you and Danny could breathe. That's all it was. She shook her head slowly, and then she said, every time I thanked Danny for figuring out the budget, he just said we were fine. She paused. He was protecting me. He was, I said, because I asked him to. Put it where it belongs. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, thank you, Raymond. Just that. No performance, no elaboration. Just 2 words with about 6 years of weight behind them. I hugged Connor, kissed the top of Lily's head, told them Pop loved them very much, and I drove home. The drive back to Naperville takes about 40 minutes on a quiet Saturday night. I drove it without the radio. The highway was dark, and the orange glow of the Chicago suburbs spread out to the east, and I felt something I hadn't anticipated, sitting alone in that truck with the miles going by. Not triumph, not satisfaction in the sharp, hot sense of the word. Something quieter. The feeling of having set something down that you've been carrying so long you stop noticing the weight of it. The feeling of not having to go back. Danny called me on Sunday morning. He said, Dad, I'm sorry I didn't say anything years ago. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, she's not going to come around, you know, Renata. She's going to be angry, and she's going to manage it, and she's going to find a way to tell the story where she comes out fine. I know, I said. Does that bother you? I thought about it. I was standing at the kitchen window, looking at the backyard, the oak tree my wife planted the second year we were in that house. Decades ago now. No, I said. It doesn't. Because? Because I didn't do it for her, I said. I did it for Brianna, and for Connor and Lily, and for you, and for me, a little, because some things need to be said out loud before they calcify into permanent furniture. Danny was quiet. You good? I asked. Yeah, he said. I'm good, Dad. We talked for a while about Connor's soccer season, and whether Lily was going to need glasses, and a recipe Brianna had been trying to figure out that had something to do with short ribs. Normal things. Life continuing at its regular temperature. It was 3 days later when Frank called. He called on a Tuesday evening. I was on the back porch with my iced tea and a library book I had been working through for 2 weeks. The evening was cool, and the oak tree was doing its October thing, and I let the phone ring twice before I picked it up. Raymond. Frank. A pause. The specific pause of a man who has been thinking about a phone call for 3 days and still doesn't entirely know how to begin it. I recognized it because I have made that pause myself. She wasn't trying to. He stopped. Started over. You know how she gets about the house, about appearances. It's not. He stopped again. Frank, I said. Yeah? You don't need to defend her. And you don't need to apologize for her. Those are 2 different things, and only one of them is yours to do. He was quiet. The apology, I said. If you have something that is genuinely yours to say, I'm listening. Another long pause. The neighbors' wind chimes were going softly down the fence line. I saw it happening, Frank said finally. Not just at dinner. Over the years. I saw the way she talked about you and I let it go because it was easier than the conversation. That's on me. After. After. That's on me. I sat with that for a moment. Yes, I said. It is. I'm sorry, Raymond. I know. We talked for another 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with any of it. The single malt, a fishing trip we'd talked about for 3 years and never scheduled, his grandkids. Before we got off the phone, Frank said, very quietly, almost as an aside, "You did a hell of a thing for Danny. I didn't know." "I should have known, but I didn't." "You weren't supposed to," I said. Still, I agreed. I hung up and sat there a while longer in the October evening. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something that probably wasn't there. A car went by slowly, headlights sweeping across the fence. Normal neighborhood quiet. I never received a direct apology from Renata. I want to be precise about that because I think it matters how the story ends, and I'm not going to manufacture an ending that didn't happen. What I received, about 2 weeks later, was a text that Brianna forwarded me. It was a message Renata had sent to Brianna directly. I won't recite it word for word. What it said, essentially, was that she understood there were things that had been mishandled and that she hoped it would not affect the relationship going forward. It was carefully worded. It was more careful than it was sorry. But it was also something. From Renata. It was probably everything she had. I told Brianna to leave it where it was, not to push, not to extract more from it than it was. There's a Sunday morning in November I want to tell you about. About a month after that dinner in Joliet, Danny and Brianna brought the kids over for breakfast. I made a full spread, the kind my wife used to make on Sunday mornings: eggs, thick-cut bacon, biscuits from scratch, orange juice in the good glasses. Connor set the table without being asked, which he has started doing lately, and it is one of those small things that tells you something real about who a 7-year-old is becoming. Lily sat on the kitchen counter and talked to me about everything that had happened in kindergarten that week, which was considerable and detailed and required my full attention. After we ate, Danny went out back to rake the leaves, because he does that now every time he visits, just picks up the rake from the side of the house and gets to it without a word. Brianna was washing dishes and I was drying them, and we were talking about nothing, the particular easy nothing of people who have moved past something together. And she said, quietly, without looking up from the sink, "I want you to know, I told Danny to stop the transfers." I looked at her. "He argued with me," she said, "but I told him I wanted to handle the gap ourselves now. I want to know we're doing it." She was quiet for a second. "I think we can. I think we're actually fine now." I nodded. "Okay. I'm not trying to be ungrateful. Brianna." I set down the dish I was holding. "That is the right call. That's exactly right." She nodded once, briskly, the way she does when she's holding herself together. "That boy of mine," I said, "picked a good one." She laughed, a quick, genuine laugh that she covered with the back of her wrist, and then she went back to the dishes. Later that afternoon, Connor and I were raking the last corner of the backyard together, which primarily consisted of Connor redistributing piles I had already made and calling it helping, which I fully endorsed. He stopped for a moment and leaned on the small rake I had bought specifically to his size last fall, and he looked up at me with that serious face he gets. Pop, he said. "Yeah, bud. Are you and Uncle Frank still fighting?" Children ask things directly that adults spend 45 minutes working up to. It is one of their great gifts. "No," I said. "We're not fighting. We had a disagreement about something, and we talked about it." He considered this. "Did you say sorry?" He said sorry to me. Connor thought about this with the careful earnestness of someone for whom apologies are still a significant transaction. "Did you say it was okay?" "I told him I heard him," I said, which is the same thing. Connor tilted his head slightly, deciding whether that made sense. Apparently it did, because he went back to redistributing leaves. I stood there in my backyard on a November afternoon. The oak tree was bare now, and the sky behind it was the particular flat gray of a Midwest November that has never once bothered me. My son was raking leaves 20 feet away. My granddaughter was on the back porch with her mother singing something to her stuffed rabbit. My grandchildren carry my name. They belong in every room they walk into, and they know it. 31 years of building something from nothing. 31 years of staying quiet at tables where people measured me against a standard they had invented without asking. 31 years of choosing the long view over the quick response, and loving people more than I needed to be credited for loving them. One conversation at a dinner table with good china and bad assumptions. And then the long, warm, unhurried work of continuing. My name is Raymond Doyle. I am 63 years old. I live in Naperville, Illinois, and every single person who matters in my life has always known exactly who I am. They just needed a little help seeing it clearly. That's what a real father does. And a real grandfather. And, when the moment finally requires it, a real man. If this story stayed with you, friends, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every one of them, and I will see you on the next one.